Welcome everybody, by the way. We're going to begin at 5:05, just to give people time to come in. Okay, if I stop sharing, David, do you want to take it away?
Okay. Just to say welcome to everyone. Welcome to our distinguished panelists who are here to give the second of the Grand Challenges seminars. My name is David Pyle and I'm Academic Director of the Doctoral Training Partnership. And the Doctoral Training Partnerships are funded by the UK Research Council, NERC, Natural Environment Research Council. And they were established about 7 or 8 years ago as a way of building cohorts of graduate study. So in Oxford's case, we have a doctoral training partnership which funds around 20 PhD or DPhil students per year. And in Oxford, our students will come in, they come in, some with an idea of a project and others not so much with an idea of a project. And over the first 6 months, they have intensive training, develop a research proposal, and can then end up doing their specializing for their DPhil in one of 9 departments across the university. For me, the doctoral training partnership has been an incredibly effective way of kind of creating a network of scholars who have different backgrounds, different disciplines, and it just gives it's actually a really effective way of letting people kind of experience or have all the benefits of having peers in disciplines outside their own, but kind of working in the same sort of area. One of the activities that we do in terms of giving students agency is through the Grand Challenges seminar. And so the themes for the seminar, the speakers, invited speakers, the hosting of the seminar is all planned and run by the student cohort. So it's a huge privilege and a pleasure to welcome everyone to this week's seminar. I'll pass over to Jack McMinn, who's going to do the introductions. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, David. And once again, welcome everyone. We've got a lot to get into. This is a very ambitious topic for a seminar. What is the value of nature? So let's just quickly run through our abstracts. Nature obviously is seen as valuable to many people. There's global initiatives to conserve and manage the environment, constant debates and intergovernmental processes in order to moderate climate change and environmental degradation in a number of ways. But what we're going to do with this seminar is explore why nature is perceived as so valuable. Why do we need to protect the rainforests? Is nature's value something intrinsic, or is it purely linked with human interests, economic incentives, or health incentives, or otherwise? If nature does have some intrinsic value, if nature itself exists outside of the human perspective of it, how does something so nebulous become quantified and thus addressable within the context of policymaking? How do we protect something that is so difficult to define? So this is a very broad topic. So we have 3 excellent speakers here today on this call. I'm just going to quickly introduce them to you. They are going to be approaching this problem from probably very different ways, but that's the exciting thing of a seminar, I guess. So to start off with, we have Professor Michael Nelson, and to read his short biography, Michael Paul Nelson holds the Ruth H. Spaniel Chair in Renewable Resources and is Professor of Environmental Ethics and Philosophy at Oregon State University. Though a philosopher in training, Michael works extensively with ecologists and social scientists. He is a collaborator with the Isle Royale Wolf Moose Project in Lake Superior, US, the longest continuous study of predator and prey in the world. and he serves as the lead principal investigator for the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest long-term ecological research program funded by the US National Science Foundation in the Oregon Cascade Mountains. Michael holds a PhD from Lancaster University in the UK and has held faculty appointments at the University of Wisconsin, University of Idaho, and Michigan State University. His book, Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, co-edited by Kathleen Dean Moore, will be released in a 10th anniversary edition this autumn. Currently, Michael is working on projects on the challenges, in brackets, and joys of interdisciplinary collaboration, ethics and climate change, issues in wildlife, especially wolves, and a little side project, as he puts it, plotting and scheming with colleagues on how to overthrow the dominant Newtonian/mechanistic worldview. Welcome, Michael. It's lovely to have you here. We also have Dr. Daniela Fecht, who is a lecturer in geospatial health in the MRC Center for Environment and Health at the School of Public Health at Imperial College. Daniela studied geography in Germany and has worked in environmental epidemiology and health geography over the past 15 years. Her research focuses on the geographical variation in population health in relation to environmental and social drivers, particularly in cities. She's worked extensively on the impact of pollution and green infrastructure on health with a view of addressing the future challenges of environmental change. Well, very happy to have you here, Daniela. And last but certainly not least, we have Seijo Patel, who is an environmental economics researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, or the IIED. Her work focuses on climate and environmental finance, public policy, and governance, particularly in relation to low carbon, climate resilient development, and on the themes of supporting inclusive and equitable processes that bridge local priorities and voices with the national and international levels. Sejal is currently undertaking research on the incentives for inclusive green and blue economies, and is also part of the IIED's technical support to the LDC Group's initiative for effective adaptation and resilience. Prior to IIED, Sejal worked on these research areas at the think tank Overseas Development Institute, or the aforementioned ODI. Sejal owns MSc in Environmental Economics from the London School of Economics, and a BSc in Economics and Geography from University College London. It's lovely to have you with us, Sejal. So without further ado, we're going to have each of our members of our panel discussing their response to this question that we pose in the seminar at face value. So we're going to be starting with Michael, and then Daniela, and then Sejal. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation and all the work putting this together. Let me see if I can. There we go. Just threw a few slides together to illustrate my talk and to make my face smaller on the screen. So my assigned task is to speak about the intrinsic value of nature. So what do we mean when we say that? What are we talking about when we say nature or anything really is intrinsically valuable? There's a huge literature on this, and there are a number of ways to answer that question. And there are some philosophical nuances that would be required for a more complete and certainly tedious treatment of intrinsic value. But fundamentally, to suggest that nature is intrinsically valuable is to suggest that it should be considered valuable, worthy, important beyond its instrumental value or beyond its use value. So, for example, to suggest that wolves or wildlife possess intrinsic value is to say that they have value even beyond what they can provide as ecosystem engineers or ecotourism revenue generators, that they have value in their own right, in and of themselves, as an end in themselves, that they possess direct moral standing. Those are other expressions of this notion of intrinsic value. So while suggesting that nature or some part of nature should be considered intrinsically valuable, it has actually a long history in my discipline of environmental philosophy, going back at least 40 years. And it has something of a history in some branches of Western conservation. I'm thinking of American conservationist Aldo Leopold's land ethic, for instance. And that idea of intrinsic value of the non-human world certainly has a long history in perhaps many, if not all, indigenous cultures. It might actually be, more unfamiliar to in the Western world, at least for the past few hundred years. So one question we could ask right away is, why would we be interested in attaching intrinsic value to nature? Well, first, it might just be simply an honest and genuine expression of our feelings about the value of nature. But if we think more pragmatically, that attribution of intrinsic value shifts the burden of proof in an important way. If something possesses intrinsic value, then it's innocent until proven guilty, to express it in more legal terms. So while instrumental value arguments for saving wolves are contingent, right? They're subject to being overridden if we find out they don't generate that much revenue, or they don't engineer ecosystems in the way we thought, or we figure out a way to do it. Overriding something's intrinsic value is difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. It would mean, for instance, that if someone wished to kill wolves for some reason, that they would have the burden of proof to justify that killing, not those who oppose the killing. So I think a couple of things are important to note with regard to intrinsic value. First, I think a really important thing to note is that it's not the negation of instrumental value. That is, if we say nature possesses intrinsic value, we're not suggesting that arguments about ecosystem services or the instrumental valuation of nature are inappropriate. Intrinsic value is sometimes described as an accretion. It's an addition, it's another layer of moral obligation. This is supposed to illustrate these notions of accretion, of moral obligation and direct moral standing. So for example, we all believe our children are intrinsically valuable, but that doesn't stop us from, taking the tax write-off for having children or asking them to mow the lawn. We in our lives, we can put these things together, and we often do. It's critical, I think, to note that intrinsic value is value beyond or in addition to instrumental value. And I realize that seems like a really simple point, but it's actually quite amazing how often it is confused in conservation discussions, what people think that intrinsic value implies. The second thing I would say that I wanted a kind of clarification is a belief in an intrinsic value of nature, or at least some part of nature, can be and actually has been empirically demonstrated. There was a study published in 2015, for example, in the peer-reviewed journal Conservation Biology, that showed that more than 80% of the general public in Ohio, and Ohio is one of our moderate states, and this was repeated nationwide, more than 80% were willing to attribute intrinsic value to wildlife, or at least so a part of nature. The other thing that's interesting about this study is that high rate of intrinsic value attribution crossed all demographic variables: gender, economic, education, rural, urban dwelling. All variables had high willingness to attribute intrinsic value to wildlife. There have been other studies that have showed similar things. Another bit of empirical evidence is that when the US's Endangered Species Act is put before the public for approval, the Endangered Species Act is the legal codification of the idea that species possess intrinsic value. It regularly and routinely receives about a 90% approval rating with the general public. So it's not seemingly that strange. So for me, this has really changed things. It occurred to me that a finding like that really changes the work that some of us might do. I would say that for the past 20 years or so, I thought that the work of some of us in environmental philosophy and other related disciplines was to convince people to attribute intrinsic value to nature, to change a fundamental value, which our environmental sociology colleagues have pointed out that it's a notoriously difficult thing to do. But maybe that's not our work. Maybe people are already willing or some critical mass are already willing to do that. So that maybe changes the work. What is our work then? Maybe our task is to find ways for people to act with integrity, right? Integrity, integer, wholeness, finding new and creative ways to match how we value the world with how we act in that world. That's a very different job than trying to convince people to attribute intrinsic value to nature. There was a great question in Jack's introduction, and it was in the materials that was provided for us. And in those materials, as a way for us to get the panelists to think about the topic, the organizers asked, how could something so nebulous as intrinsic value be quantified and addressed in public policy? And it's just a great question. I think that's exactly the right thing we have to start thinking about. One of the jobs I've taken on and I've tried to do is make it really maybe not so nebulous of a concept. But the first thing I think I would say in response to that question is, I don't think I can say anything very general about this, and it might vary from instance to instance, and we might figure it out as we actually started to take that notion seriously and work on certain specific things. In other words, it might emerge from the work that we would do. But I think in general, what I would say is that we should look to how we handle intrinsic value in humans, in policy, law, and other forms of decision-making. We might look to other cultures that attribute intrinsic value to nature and see how they do it. We might look to instances where we already do it. And again, I think of the Endangered Species Act. We already have policies that seem to attribute intrinsic value to nature. So I think there are some starts that we can make. And the final thing I want to say is that I think the attribution of intrinsic value opens up new questions and new conversations for us. If a forest, for example, is intrinsically valuable, then maybe we shouldn't see it as, or call it, natural resources, or any of the other words that we use that reduce its value in some way. Maybe we need forms of expression that actually demonstrate its value. To borrow from my indigenous colleague, the writer, scientist, Robin Kimmerer, maybe we could see the forest as a gift, which in turn requires us to think about appropriate forms of reciprocity and gratitude. Or maybe we can think about the utilization of a forest or an ocean or a farmland as a kind of harvest. If the forest possesses intrinsic value, then we're called to act in different ways. We're called at least to act honorably as we harvest that forest. So the question becomes, what is an honorable harvest? What does that look like? What does it demand of us? Seeing the forest as intrinsically valuable, as a gift, as something with which we must have an honorable relationship, does not mean that we can or would never harvest a tree, not at all. But I think it does require us to walk through and engage with the world in new and unique and different ways. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's some amazing place to kick off this discussion. All right, next we have Daniela, who's going to be discussing this same question, but presumably from a different angle. So over to you, Daniela.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for organizing this really, really interesting debate. So I'm coming to this question from a slightly different angle. So I'm presenting the human health perspective. And also looking at, I sort of define nature slightly differently, because as you heard in the introduction, my focus of research is on cities. So I'm looking at how do we interact and how do we experience nature within cities, in particular green space. And in doing so, I'm drawing off work which has been done by some of my students, both master's students and PhD students, and some of them are also DTP students at Imperial College. So if we start thinking about health, or the impact of nature or green space on health, I think we have to look back a really long time where people historically also always benefited or were aware of the benefits of nature on health. But if you look at a sort of more scientific perspective, the first sort of real scientific evidence of this relationship sort of started emerging in the 1980s. This is a really interesting paper which was published around this time in the journal Science, which looked at patients in a hospital in Pennsylvania and compared those patients who had a room overlooking trees and a parkland versus those rooms which overlooked a brick wall. And what they found was that patients with rooms which were overlooking a natural scene had a much shorter post-operative hospital stay. They received fewer negative comments in their nurses' notes, and they took fewer potent painkillers. So that was the first sort of scientific evidence that nature or exposure to nature, even if it's just looking at it rather than experiencing it, walking through it, might have health benefits. And since then, there has been a lot of attention on this link between green space and health. And this is sort of the number of studies which has been published since 1996. And you can see there is this really, really stark increase in publications looking at this relationship over the last decade or so. And the sort of most consistent evidence that we have in which green space interacts with both physical and mental health is in relation to a decrease in mortality rates. We have improvement of cardiovascular systems, increased attention, improved mood. So this was more sort of cognitive factors, and also increased physical activity levels with all the health benefits that brings. And this is sort of well known, and I show this slide here, which is from the House of Parliament post note on green space on health, which really nicely summarizes the scientific evidence that currently exists, as I said, on both physical and mental illness, which are associated with green space. We have accessible green space, which is green space which you can actually go to, such as parks or even footpaths and fields, which are associated with better mental health. And interestingly, the last point, which is that exposure to nature could potentially be used as part of treatment for some conditions. And there are currently trials ongoing where GPs can prescribe exposure to nature to certain patients. But the sort of, how do we actually define green space or greenness? And how does it impact on health? Because obviously, if you talk about greenness, there are many, many different aspects that we need to talk about. So I mentioned, visible green space. Green space is accessible so that you can specifically experience. Is, for example, walking in a field similar to walking in a forest? Does the species diversity of the forest impact on how strong this link with health is, and so on? So there are many, many different what we call mechanisms or pathways which have been sort of suggested of how green space can improve health and well-being. So one of them is that it might reduce environmental exposures, for example, a better air quality, lower levels of noise, lower temperatures. It might increase the likelihood for someone to be physically active, so play sports in a park or go for a walk, do gardening in their own private garden, for example. It could be via stress reduction, so it has an improved impact on cognition and physiological restoration. It increases social contact, so you might go for a walk with your neighbor, or you might meet people as you are out in the park. And I think it's something which we have seen over the last year, where people, while we were in lockdown, went to the park to meet other people. So it's a really, really strong sort of incentive to be socially active. And an interesting pathway which has not been explored so much is in terms of the biodiversity, so increased biodiversity, means higher exposure to a larger variety of different bacteria, which is in particular being linked to improvements in the gut biome. So if we are going to talk about how does nature or green space improve health, and I think that's really important if you sort of want to make the argument that it is important to maintain and restore and increase, then we need to be very careful and be very specific about what it is about this green space and what type of a green space might be most beneficial. So in order to do that, I give you an example of 2 studies which we have recently conducted, looking at specific aspects of or specific pathways mentioned here. So the first one is green routes, and by that we mean any path which goes through green space. So that might be a footpath through a forest, or it might be a footpath through a park, or it might even be a sidewalk with street trees, and link this to physical activity. And you can see here how we've done this. So you can see a sort of a little house where someone lives, and then we look at the footpaths that are available within a 10-minute walk around their house, and then overlaid that with both ground cover vegetation and trees. And we looked at self-report or meeting national recommendations for moderate and vigorous physical activity levels. And we also looked at self-reported physical activity of both moderate and high level. And what we found is that as people have more of those green routes around their house, their likelihood to be more physical active increases. So if you look at I'm not going into too much detail in those results, but if you look at the first row, so the Q2, 3, 4, and 5 indicates quintiles of exposure. So the quintile 5 would be people with the highest exposure to green routes have a 39% more likelihood or a higher odds of meeting moderate physical activity levels. So I think this is really important if we want to sort of increase people to be more active, if we can do that potentially via improved footpaths through parks and so on. And the second study I wanted to show is something which we just finished, which is looking at private gardens and risk of mortality. And here we looked at people's immediate area around their house, so within 100 meters. And we looked at different types of green space. And one of them was private gardens. Others were allotments. We looked at general parks, sports facilities, sports fields, and so on. And what we found was that for most conditions that we looked at, so we looked at all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, respiratory mortality, and so on, we saw that there was a reduction in the risk of mortality with increased exposure to green space. And as you can see with this dark blue bar, this was particularly strong for private residential gardens. So if people had loads of private gardens or garden space around them, their risk of mortality was lower. So I think the sort of important messages here are that it's the use, the access, and the use of private gardens might confer specific health benefits. And the mechanism by which this works is potentially via psychological and physical activities such as gardening. And in terms of policy recommendation of equal access to private gardens is really important, because obviously private gardens is something that not everyone has access to. So in order to counteract that, the provision of public green space for private use for growing vegetables or for gardening might be something that would be really beneficial. So to summarize up and sort of bring it back again to the question. So I think there is this multitude of empirical evidence which links exposure to green space and improved health and well-being. But we have to have a really clear understanding of which of those different underlying pathways and mechanisms it is that it is the most crucial for us to address. And I think coming back to what I said earlier, it's about this equal access to nature, which is in particular important to avoid widening the inequality gap. I just want to acknowledge all the people who helped doing this research presented here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Apologies for my sudden change in background. There were some internet problems on my end, but I think they have been resolved. So we've addressed this problem through a philosophical, ecological perspective. We've just seen it through the lens of human health and human infrastructure. And to round off this opening section of the seminar, we're now going to turn to a more economical perspective with Sejal. Over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks Jack. I'll just share my screen. Great, can everyone see that? Great, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a very interesting and a very big topic. And as Jack mentioned, I'll be talking from an economics perspective. I'll start briefly setting the scene of how nature has been characterized in economics, and then discuss natural capital accounting as an evolving approach that seeks to address some of the shortcomings of this. And then the second half of the presentation will then highlight some findings from a study that we're at IIED currently supporting that's exploring natural capital integration in COVID economic recovery packages in 4 countries. So the value of nature has generally been, and it continues to be, left out of traditional economic modeling. So our use of natural resources and the services and the degradation and depletion of those resources or services are not being accounted for. Nature has consequently largely been left out of national economic decision-making and financial accounting. That makes negative externalities common, and it makes the incentives of the system inclined to encourage exploitation. Natural capital accounting is an approach that seeks to bring the value of nature into balance sheets. And it's important for all countries to have a picture of the value of the resources that they have in order to plan and maintain and also strengthen their resource base over time. There have been some landmark publications that have been released this year that I think are worth mentioning. One key publication is the Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta review. This review was commissioned by the UK Treasury in 2019 and released earlier this year. And it was intended to help set up the agenda for the UK government's 25-year environment plan. The reviews produced a rigorous exposition of the economics of natural capital and its importance to economic wealth, and set out a sophisticated theory of how institutions impact natural capital. However, it is lacking tangible figures on the cost of inaction on biodiversity loss, and also fiscal and monetary policy recommendations for decision makers. This publication that's come a few months later sort of addresses that. This is from the World Bank, the economic case for nature, and it lays out the economic rationale for investing in nature. This report aims to provide insights that inform the process leading up to the 15th Conference of the Parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD, and assist countries to implement the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So the report itself lays out several key findings, and the high-level findings are that global decline of biodiversity and ecosystem services is a development issue. Economies, particularly those in low-income countries, cannot afford the risk of collapse in the services provided by nature. nature smart policies can reduce the risk of ecosystem collapse and are win-win policies in terms of biodiversity and economic outcomes. The more countries that cooperate, the better the outcomes are, and that the nature and the climate change agendas are complementary, and there are synergies to be exploited to foster green, resilient, and inclusive development. So as I was mentioning earlier, natural capital accounting is a tool to bring the value of nature into accounting sheets. And in March this year, countries adopted standards for the natural capital accounting. There's a bit of a mouthful. It's called the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, the SEA Ecosystem Accounting. And it's a framework that integrates economic and environmental data to provide a more comprehensive and interrelated view between the economy and the environment, and the stocks and the changes in the stocks of environmental assets. And then just to point out, there are a number of international initiatives that are ongoing at the moment that are supporting countries with integrating natural capital accounting. So just two here are one from the UN, Natural Capital Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, which is an initiative supporting Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. And another one by the World Bank, Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, the WAVES initiative, which is supporting around 22 countries. So this is the study that we've been supporting at IIED. And given that natural capital accounting is still such a nascent and newly emerging area, and that governments are not consistently taking natural capital, wealth, and value into account in economic decision making, this study focuses on the kind of investment decisions made in the pandemic era. So we've been working in partnership with the Green Economy Coalition and with 4 country partners, FAS in Brazil, Vertical Lab in France, Tara Development Alternatives in India, and Akode in Uganda. And we've been carrying out a study that looks at natural capital integration into the pandemic recovery packages, because those are the most high-profile economic decisions being made at the moment. The pandemic, one of the impacts of the pandemic is that it's caused major cash flow issues. It's created incentives to exploit nature for short-term gains in order for people, businesses, and countries to keep going. And that makes it essential to have strong public policy that provides social welfare, safety nets, and other such sort of measures that will mitigate those negative incentives. So the ideal is to aim for a natural capital-based green economy. And that is an economy that uses natural capital approaches, so knowledge, tools, and methods, to better understand the reliance of economic activity on natural systems and integrate that thinking and data into a greener economic model of doing business, making policy, investing resources, reforming sectors, and governing the economy. To date, progress on integration of natural capital in economic recovery has been slow. And with the exception of the EU's Green New Deal, there's very little data available on progress within developing countries. And COVID-19, the pandemic itself, is a consequence partly from our lack of regard for the natural world. And it's exposed a lot of inequalities and a lack of resilience of the economies. So the kind of pandemic recovery packages are an attempt to safeguard lives and increase economic growth. And that's where they present a huge opportunity to prioritize, for the first time ever, safeguarding natural capital, investing in ecosystem resilience, and putting in place mechanisms for integrating natural capital into economic decision-making. According to Vivid Economics, who did a study and produced a greenness of stimulus index, the total amount up to, I think when this figure was taken, I think earlier this year, sometime in May, was 11.8 trillion US dollars was invested in post-COVID stimulus packages, and trillions more are still being invested and will be invested over the long term through the recovery. So that's a huge amount of financing with the potential to support natural capital. And according to the World Economic Forum, prioritizing nature and integrating natural capital into economic and policy decision-making could create 395 million jobs and $10.1 trillion in annual business value by 2030. So I'll very quickly talk through the objectives, methodology, results, and recommendations of this study. So the objectives were threefold: to influence the pandemic recovery packages in Brazil, India, Uganda, and France, to mainstream natural capital into economic decision-making, to drive these decisions, and to seek to understand what drives these decisions, and how they can be made more sustainable, and to draw general lessons and make broader recommendations for countries on how they can sustain and conserve natural capital in their COVID recovery packages. So we looked at budgetary, fiscal, monetary, and trade policies, and we looked at both positive and negative examples. So if you're looking at a positive example of budgetary policy, that might be identifying national political priorities as green recovery. So a green growth program, for example. A fiscal policy that's positive might be around putting into place expenditure policies in favor of sustaining and conserving natural capital, natural resources like organic agriculture, controlling illegal fishing, employment programs that link to tree planting, that kind of thing. And then also monetary policies like environmentally friendly green enterprises. And then negative policies, on the other hand, might be, in terms of the budget, something that doesn't reference green or sustainable recovery or pushes fossil fuels as a key energy strategy, for example. Fiscal policies that, again, encourage the depletion of nature, and similar for monetary policies. So very quickly, our results. So you can see here, we'd sort of categorize the different interventions in the recovery policies as either strong or low, negative or positive impact, neutral, or unable to assess, which means the countries didn't give enough information about what that policy would entail. So you couldn't really understand whether that would be having a positive or negative impact on their natural capital. And you can see here, Brazil has the most negative recovery package, and Uganda has the most strongly positive. France is weakly positive, but it's very sort of neutral. And in India, it's mostly ambiguous. So it will depend on the implementation of that recovery package. And this just shows that again, but in comparison by category. So then you can see quite clearly Uganda as being strong, Brazil as being very weakly negative, and India as being ambiguous. And then just to highlight an example from the Brazil case study that was looking only at the Amazon states. So those are 9 states. And that represents 60% of the country, but only 9% of GDP. So that is characterized by low rates of social and economic development, but it is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. And not to go into this too much, but I'll show you very quickly the measures which showed, this is the list of positive measures in their recovery package. There were 12 measures, and the most, I'm just moving my screen, the highest one, well, the most value, which was $942 million US, was for rural credits and subsidies. And that was a positive measure because it supported no-till farming, recovery of degraded pastures, crop, livestock, forest integration, that kind of activity that tended to decrease the pressure on deforestation. But that only amounted altogether as $1 billion US, whereas the negative measures, of which there were 9, amount to 9.1 billion. And 9 billion of that is for this measure, subsidies and rural credit for the agricultural sector. And the reason that's negative is because that's encouraging the expansion of agriculture in the Amazon area. So it's encouraging deforestation and exploitation of that area. And so conversations are ongoing about a bioeconomy in the Amazon region, where rather than pushing for the expansion of agriculture, which they're doing because they want to increase economic activity and revenue in that area, which does have a very low GDP at the moment, they could support commercial activities that generate additional value, but are supporting native products of the region, like the Brazil nut or acai, and helping to build those value chains would help the local people build sort of economic activity in the area while still supporting sustainable use of the forest resources. So that kind of shows quite clearly why putting nature at the center of economic decision-making can support health, economic, social development in a way that's sustainable, and how that can be done. And just to end on some of the recommendations coming out of that study, the big one is that government should invest in natural capital to bring economic benefits and growth opportunities. And a lot of those reports at the beginning from the World Bank and the Dasgupta Review do show that investing in natural capital bring multiplier effects, bring a lot more value than these kind of depletive policies. And then some specific recommendations for recovery packages, like avoiding supporting environmentally damaging agribusiness, avoiding damaging mining and those kind of policies. And just to note that these case studies are forthcoming and will be coming out in the next couple of months. And the idea is that to use these country case studies, each of these country organizations will then use these findings and use the kind of recommendations on how to turn these negative natural capital approaches into positive policies to advocate in their countries for shifts in better natural capital accounting, to integrate that into their public policies. So I'll leave it there, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sejal. So we've had our panel's initial reactions to the prompt, the abstract as a prompt. So the next stage of the seminar, we're going to be asking some specific questions and hear their responses. But after that, we're going to have questions from the audience. So if you have any questions for the panel or any individual member of the panel, please write them in the chat while we go through this next section, and also write who they're addressed to. Right, so the first question that we're going to address in this stage is talking about the purity of nature. So is protecting nature and conserving its current state, i.e. as it is now, is that sufficient? Or are we missing social, economic, or even ecological opportunities by augmenting natural environments in some way? So Michael, what do you have to think in response to that prompt?
That's a tough question for me. Yeah, I always assume we're missing something. Mostly that's just an extension of the belief that I'm probably missing something. And I don't know if we're missing economic or augmenting opportunities. I'm sure we're not doing full cost accounting, or we're overestimating the benefit and underestimating the cost of certain actions as we tend to do. But I think when I think of missed opportunities, I think of missed opportunities of imagination. Of moral imagination. Every concept of value has what I would call like an imagination scope. It limits what we think is possible in the world. If we expand that notion of value, then the imagination scope changes in kind. So I do think there are some opportunities to think of valuation as a way to imagine our way into the future. I'm concerned that we can more readily imagine the complete collapse of the world than we can a future without fossil fuels, for instance. That there's a failure of imagination that's important here.
Daniela, is there any benefit to augmenting nature in any way to, say, augment or aid human health, or indeed anything else?
I think that's an interesting question. It comes sort of back to what I sort of was alluding to at the talk, that you really have to understand the sort of processes that are going on. I know there have been studies conducted on, just giving people some virtual reality of green space and just showing them green pictures, and seeing if that already triggers the same sort of cognitive response than actual nature. And I also sort of hinted at the fact on biodiversity and how the natural state of nature. And I think we have to really sort of distinguish here between nature in terms of talking about rainforest or about forests, which are still mostly untouched. I mean, they're not untouched, as we all know, but they are still nature, versus what I was focusing on, the sort of nature of pockets of nature within cities. And I think, they are sort of two different sides, and they probably need different solutions.
Excellent. And lastly, Sejal, is there any economic benefit to, well, obviously there is economic benefit to augmenting nature, but in terms of the value of nature in its state now versus some other state, does economics factor into this in any way?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and maybe one angle to this, bringing in some of the considerations from international negotiations as well around the CBD and the COP, I think, is to be careful about what we mean by the value of nature, what we mean when we say protect and conserve nature. A big part of it is to look at how people who are local to the environment live in nature and see them as stewards of nature, rather than seeing nature as something that we need to dictate as, this part needs to be protected. Developed countries can't tell Brazil, you need to protect the Amazon because that's the lungs of the world. It needs to be more of a bottom-up approach of how can people local to the Amazon use the Amazon in a way that's supporting them. And often it is the local people who are maintaining and supporting these local ecosystems better than it can be from an external point of view. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to unpick there in terms of what is nature and what does that mean, and who has the power to kind of have that perspective on what it means.
Right, sorry about that. There was a slight issue with my mouse pad of all things. Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Again, write the questions for the thing are open. Please write in the Zoom chat any questions for our panel or panelists as we move on to our second discussion question concerning whether or not nature can be divorced from the human experience. So as humans, at least from my perspective, we seem to have this very clear divide between nature and artifice. And indeed, you could argue that one is defined by the lack of another. There's also clear differences between the impacts of, say, humans and other natural entities. So we're going to start with Michael again and work through in the order. Can nature be divorced from human experience?
We can conceptualize it that way, and it. I guess my answer is yes and no, right? It can be divorced for certain purposes, and we do that a lot for certain purpose. And there's some benefits to it and there's some costs to it. So there are times when that seems like a really helpful thing to do, right? I want to know, I want to be able to distinguish human-caused climate change or biodiversity loss from background rates, for instance. And then in the next minute, I can think to myself about my gut microbiome, which is me and not me all at the same time. It's very blurry, and I can do that in my head. There are other times when we do that, and what we do, and there's something at stake, right? We're continuing to perpetuate the false dualism, the absolute dualism between humans and nature, which in turn inevitably seems not just to be a distinction. The reason we're concerned with it is we overlay a value on top of that distinction. So the metaphysical distinction becomes also an ethical distinction, which just props up anthropocentrism once again, which many have argued that's what ultimately sits at the root of many of our environmental problems. So that's a philosopher's answer for you.
It's a good answer at that. Daniela, what do you think?
I suppose in a way, nature can exist without humans, but humans can't exist without nature. And I would have, used the example of the gut biome, which I'm not going to now. But I think it's just in a sort of, more general note. There is some research being done on the impact of climate change, for example, on mental health. And in particular, focusing on the sort of the sense of loss of nature. So if everyone is used to a certain biodiversity around them, a certain temperature patterns, a certain vegetation around them throughout their childhood, adolescence, and then into adulthood. And as this changes, people really experience a strong sense of loss, which can manifest itself in mental health issues. So I think that's sort of one of the examples where we really sort of seem to be depending on the nature around us. And it's not just any nature, it's the nature that we are used to.
Thank you very much. And lastly, Sejal, can you figure out a way of tying the gut microbiome into economics?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but maybe to add the, again, from the perspective of international climate negotiations, I think that's a pretty critical reason to consider nature and anthropogenic forcing separately. If we're having an impact on the environment, if we're causing or accelerating certain natural or climatic changes, it's quite crucial to understand who's causing those, how they're being caused, when and why. That's the whole argument of why developed countries owe a debt of responsibility to developing countries. So where you see small island developing states, where you see climate vulnerable countries being impacted, to be able to assign that responsibility and understand those kind of dynamics, I think it's quite critical to be able to understand where something is a natural system and where something's been accelerated or changed because of human intervention.
Thank you very much. And the last question we're going to discuss in this part of the seminar is, it's more of a personal opinion. How do you think that humans should change their evaluation of nature, and what kind of factors do we need to consider if we are to reevaluate nature? Social issues, social justice. We live in a complex world, and so if we are to make any changes, we'd have a lot to consider. So, Michael, what do you think?
I think even within the kind of anthropocentric view, we have to get a lot better. We have disproportionate impacts on people that are by any measure of justice not just. So we certainly have to think harder within the anthropocentric realm. But I don't think that's ultimately going to get us where we need to go, as important as it is. I think again, I'll go back to imagination, our unleashing of our imagination of what the world actually looks like, a change in worldview, seems to be critical. And I would say that, if we look around, even in Western culture, Western intellectual culture, we see this emerging. I'm thinking of the forest ecologist Suzanne Simard's new book on mother trees, on how trees cooperate and share resources, which is such a different view than the idea that everything is only competing all of the time, which we sometimes use to prop up our own political structures and attitudes. I'm thinking of the history of my own discipline in environmental ethics for the last 40 years. Many people, Arne Ness, Val Plumwood, Baird Callicott, Freya Matthews, have been arguing and putting forward positions on the intrinsic value of nature. I'm thinking of emerging other disciplines and emerging ideas. I'm thinking about Jane Bennett's new materialism, for instance, that are attributing in some way mindedness, to use a kind of generic, to nature. So I think this alternative or different worldview is here. We have it. It's the question is, how do we allow it to emerge and come forth and challenge us in a way.
Thank you very much, Daniela. How does this factor into a more population health perspective?
So I think I want to use the example of air pollution here, because I think air pollution was a topic where we had for a very, very long time really strong evidence that it's really bad, and we have to improve the air we breathe for various reasons. It's climate change, human health, and so on. But policymakers didn't really take any notice of this, or they were aware of it, obviously, but the incentive to do so was not right. And I think what really sort of started changing that perception was because more and more people, or the general population, became aware that this is a problem and that it's impacting their life, and it's impacting their life negatively, and it's impacting their children, and has bad impact on healthcare systems and so on. And then there was this drive from the general population on, let's say, the mayor of London or other mayors around the world to do something. And I think that is really something which is probably needed here, and that comes back to educating people and informing people about what's the value of nature and why it's so important to preserve it or improve it or restore it.
Excellent. And Sejal, to round us off.
Sure, I'll give you 4 key changes that I'd like to see. Firstly, I'd like to see all countries using natural capital accounting and climate and nature budgeting tools, bringing that natural capital into economic decision making. And the second one related to that, integrating natural capital considerations into their COVID economic recovery plans, and continuing to do so after that within their national budgets going forward. The third one is for developed country parties to fulfill their commitments under the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and then to go forward setting more ambitious targets, significantly more ambitious targets. And the fourth one is for the climate and nature financing to support more of these climate and nature needs, especially at the local level. So support that kind of locally led adaptation, support models and sort of enterprise value chains that address social justice and inequality. So an example is the Forest and Farm Facility Initiative that's led by the FAO, and the idea is that it strengthens organizations of forest and farm producers to deliver products in climate resilient ways that's sustainable, that helps maintain the forests over time, and actually strengthens the natural capital value there. And there's a lot of evidence behind that initiative. So to see more initiatives like that being supported.
Thank you very much, and thank you for answering those questions. We have, just to finish up, one audience question from Anna Jones, who says that humans generally have a negative impact on nature if virtual reality nature experiences could offer the same benefits to humans as real nature. What do you think about separating humans from the majority of nature to leave nature more intact? I think we'll just go around again. Everyone's immediate knee-jerk reactions to this. So, Michael, what do you think about a world of virtual reality wolves?
Better for wolves, in some ways. I don't. That this question is really intriguing. There's something important about, and Daniela can probably speak to this, that these virtual reality opportunities or other kinds of opportunities, if they have some chance of enhancing our valuation of the world, they seem important. At the same time, I'm scared to death of the idea of the idea behind this idea of this separation. I think of interactions as potentially having positive or negative impacts. Again, it depends on what we mean by the value that we're assigning to nature. So I think if I think about a gift, right? Nature provides me with gifts, even undeserved gifts. And I have an obligation to accept gifts, but then to reciprocate in some way. That's an awful lot of integration that has to go on between me and the natural world. And I think you can develop a positive relationship through that kind of integration, but it's a very different way of seeing our relationship to the world and actually seeing the world itself.
Fascinating. Daniela, what do you think?
So I think it's a very interesting idea, and I think I alluded to the fact that there are studies ongoing that look at if virtual reality nature would trigger the same responses. But that was purely in relation to the sort of visual impact. I mean, if you're outside in nature, there's so many other more sort of subtle impacts. You might hear bird songs. You're sort of free from all the road traffic noise. So there are many sort of subtle influences on you which you can't take into consideration or not yet. Smell, for example, in virtual reality. But I think in general, this sort of opportunity for people to experience nature, I think it's actually a positive thing, because that really sort of shows people what nature is. And I don't think that people visiting nature is sort of the main driver of the destruction of nature. I think it's population pressure, it's industry, it's other things. So I think replacing that might be, I think it would work in some instances. In general, I think probably not.
Thank you. And Sejal, do you have any perspectives on this?
I would agree with what's been said, really. I think it's an interesting question because it sort of places nature as a whose authority is it to kind of say, let's protect nature or leave the majority of nature conserved. I think that's a very sort of interesting idea of why you'd want to leave the majority of nature to it, for example. And I would disagree with the premise that humans generally have a negative impact on nature, and that's not the necessary way that human-nature interaction needs to be. And again, if you are, as Daniela said, a lot of this is from industry and economic activity, that if you are then able to successfully integrate natural capital into the economic models, that a lot of that could be mitigated. I think there's a lot of positive sort of directions to go in terms of supporting natural capital, strengthening that.
Thank you very much. So we've got a couple of raised hands in some of the people in the actual thing, but we can ask that after the talk. We're going to just finish off with a question from Samuel S. Bright, directed at Michael, asked, what do you think needs to change in Western attitudes in order to improve our own way of thinking regarding nature and conservation?
most everything. You know, the way we look at the world is it has a long history, right? It ultimately goes back to the ancient Greeks and the answer to the question, what is the ultimate stuff of the universe? And when we landed on, you know, it's atoms that are solid bits of hard particles, the world all of a sudden became matter in motion, and the world became materialistic and reducible, profane, all of these things. Those ideas get picked up in the Renaissance, right, and become part of the Western worldview, and they replace any sense of animism. And I don't necessarily mean it in the way it's typically meant, but the idea of specialness in nature. And so I think I agree with the historian Lynn White Jr., who wrote a classic piece called The Historical Roots of Archaeological Crisis. And then he wrote an article later on trying to address some of the criticism of that article. And one of the things he says is that, you know, what we need to find is a viable equivalent to animism in our world. And it's not just ripping off another culture, although it might end up kind of in as cousins of other cultures, but it's within our own culture. Are there ways that we can make the world sacred again? And again, I don't mean that in the typical sense, but I mean it in the sense of intrinsically valuable, that we think of it. Is it about, it's part of our community? Is it about, you know, life force? Is it about, evolutionary trajectories need to be respected? Any way we can find to enhance that notion of value.
Thank you very much. So I believe that we're going to draw it to a close there. Thank you very much for coming along to this seminar. We greatly appreciate it. Do our panelists have any final things they want to say about where to find them, or, you know, where to keep their eyes on if they want more of their perspectives or work? Michael, anyone? Just go through the order.
You can just find me. You can find me on my website. I have a website, michaelpnelson.com, which has my publications. So that's the easiest place to find me.
Cool. Daniela, where can we find you?
The easiest way is probably via the website of the MSc Center for Environment and Health.
Fantastic. And Sejal?
Yep, that would be via the IIED, International Institute for Environment and Development website. And we'll have the work I was talking about coming out of that in a couple of months.
Fantastic. And with that, thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys, for coming. So what was your question, Ollie, out of curiosity?
Oh, I was actually going to ask Michael a question after about one of your slides. I was really interested because you pointed out that there was a very large percentage of people that did actually agree with the intrinsic value of nature. So I was actually going to flip the question around and sort of ask you, would you hypothesize as the reason for the minority not finding it intrinsically valuable? Because it kind of conflicted with what Daniela then went on to say, which is there's almost like a hard wiring in the human experience that when people engage with nature, they see physiological benefits, psychological benefits, but then there's a small minority of people who, despite perhaps even having that experience, would say actually they don't see a value in it at the core.
That's a great question. Like so many studies, right? We find we come up with an answer to something and it screams for another study, or we ask about a correlation. We really then want to know about a mechanism. I don't know. God, so much of what's going on here right now is just tribalism, right? I identify with a tribe, and therefore I think I have to almost be a cartoon version of everything that they believe. This study was done a little bit before we were doing this work in like 2014. So I don't know if this has changed, but I didn't think about. I mean, I was so kind of stunned by, oh my God, 80% of people were willing to admit this when given the opportunity to do it. But I didn't think about what about those 20%? Mainly because I think of 20% was such a small percentage compared to what I thought the results were going to be. So I don't have a very good answer to that.
That's okay. So it's more a hypothetical, because it seems to me like there's a good case that it should be sort of something that everybody agrees with or engages with. But then you could technically flip it around and say, well, if there's 20% of people that don't agree, how impactful are the actions of those 20% of the people on the natural world? Because if they don't believe that, and their actions are disproportionate to their percentage amongst the population, and they're the people, you know, if you happen to just survey the president of ExxonMobil and Shell and so on and so forth, you kind of then get a sense of actually maybe you can't deal with a select group of people that don't ultimately, at a core value, agree on the principle that nature has some worth to the human cause.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That study also made me wonder if I taught a class one time, and it was environmental ethics, and one of the students said something about, well, of course we all in this room value nature intrinsically, but the problem is the rest of the world doesn't. And my response was like, how in the world did I get all the people who intrinsically value nature in my class? How did that? So it made me start thinking, is it really that people aren't willing to, acknowledge that kind of value, or it's just we don't think others are, and so we're held kind of hostage to our belief about others' beliefs, and we're quiet. So is that what's going on with that 20%? Are they like, I don't want to be a weirdo? And that's a weird position, or is something else going on? I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. And with that, I think we can end this meeting. David, are you still there?
I can end it and I can stop recording. Don't worry. I have all of the power. So I'll do that.
That's what I like to hear, James. That's what I like to hear.
I've gone mad with it. So
thank you so much again for coming along and contributing. Hopefully, we all learned something. Hopefully, you all learned things. And yeah, thank you again.
Right. Thanks to you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.